The scripture reading for this morning comes from Mark 5:21 through 43. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at a point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out of him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. He put them outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated.
Thanks, Natalie. Well, good morning. My name is Ben. I'm on staff here. We're glad you're here with us. There's some $1 million words in there, Natalie. Try out Wheel of Fortune. That was awesome. We are journeying through pieces and parts of the Gospels in the New Testament. It's these first 4 books of the New Testament that tells us the life of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus, the death and resurrection. But we're seeing how Jesus encounters people, and when he encounters people, actually conversations begin, and conversations ensue, and there's all kinds of people he talks with. And one of the conversations that he has is one we'll look at this morning. He has a conversation with the desperate, a conversation with the desperate. Now, the word desperate is never used once in this story. It is never said once. But like invisible ink, it is seen when you really do look at it. Because desperation isn't said explicitly here, but this whole passage and the whole page is soaked with desperation. And actually this morning we're going to look at that and kind of squeeze that sponge out and see how desperation really does come and flow out of this particular passage. And if we're honest, we can look at times of our lives and recognize, I know what desperation feels like. I know what it's like not to have many options. I know the ability of getting to the end of myself and what that is like. And if we're honest, as we put our finger on that, we like to say, and I don't want to go back. Like, can I not go back to that point? Because that wasn't all that fun. I wasn't in control. So we know what it's like, and also we can all the while kind of loathe that particular event or season or happening. And this story really does help us engage those parts of our life. Now, I do want to also recognize something too, that this passage is full of resolve. As these 2 particular people are desperate, Jairus, I said that to my wife earlier. Jairus and the woman, they're marked with desperation, and they find resolve. Things in their life get fixed. And as you are hearing this passage, and as we'll walk through it this morning, I want to just kind of recognize from the front end, there are things in your life that are marked with desperation and may not be marked with resolve. And so I'm not here to tell you any solution or kind of sell you something or a pill to take. I just want to make sure that you feel known in the fact that Jesus sees you now. That whatever that desperation looks like, that is not resolved, even as these people's desperation that's deep is resolved, that you're in the right spot because Jesus sees you as he's doing something in you and in your story. But these two people could not be more different. We see this man, Jairus, and this woman who's bleeding, and they're wildly different stories. They're wildly different stations in life. They're completely different, and all the while, they kind of are these two dots that this potential energy begins to connect, and all of a sudden you see firing off really what desperation looks like and how Jesus actually engages them in very, very similar ways. And so this morning, we're going to get a chance to just look at those two dots as they connect of this synagogue leader and this bleeding woman and how Jesus deals with them in their desperation very, very similarly, because he's a Jesus that wants to deal with our desperation very, very similarly. So with that in mind, let me pray as we open up Mark 5 and see what it has for us this morning. King Jesus, would you be with us? Would you help the sea level of desperation rise in this room in a way that's not manufactured or in a way that isn't mustered up, but with the real, honest, earnest, authentic ways in which we are at the end of ourselves and be brought to you. Because the real, honest, authentic ways that these two people have been brought to the end of themselves, they are brought to you, and you do something really powerful with it. So this day, Jesus, give us courage. Give us courage to believe that you really are someone that meets us in our desperation. We come to you with nothing and we leave with everything. As we look at our own desperation, it's hard to believe that, and yet, Jesus, you're inviting us to it. Give us courage. Pray in your name. Amen. So these two people, this man and this woman, they are marked with desperation. And so we need to first recognize that they're coming to Jesus, but there's something that's coming before they're coming to Jesus, right? There's an origin story. There's this kind of reading in between the lines, seeing things have been gone to before they go to Jesus. There's actually in them what we see as a resistance to desperation. There's a resistance to desperation. Because something has brought them to Jesus, but there are things that they visit with their issue and the things that they go to with their particular issues. So, let's see what that looks like. Jairus. Jairus is this man. He's this synagogue leader. Right? This title he has is Archisunagos. Right? It sounds like a disease you get on a really bad cruise ship. Right? That's his name, Archisunagos. And what that means is he is the chief leader of the synagogue. That the place that Jesus is in, the area Jesus is in, that he is the chief spiritual leader of the Jewish people in that particular spot. So basically, he is the central leader of the central location and spot and way of life for those who are Jewish in that particular place, in that particular spot. Archisunagos. He is the chief synagogue leader. So culturally, he had a great deal of significance. He had a great deal of authority. He had a great deal of respect and a great deal of power. But that's professionally. Personally, what's happening? His daughter's not well. Right? He's living the parents' worst nightmare of powerlessness before something he can't do anything about. He can't fix his daughter. His need, his desperation is, I just want my kid to be well, as he's living the worst nightmare of a parent. But as this Archisunagos, as this chief official, the synagogue leader, we need to understand, what did he do before he went to Jesus? We can read in between the lines, knowing that the history of that day, wouldn't it make sense as the chief spiritual religious leader, don't you think he would have prayed? Hey, God, my daughter's sick. I really want her to be well. I can't fix her. as the chief religious leader, don't you think he would have invited other people to pray for his daughter? Hey, prayer request, here's this little thing happening with us. My daughter's not doing well. She's getting worse and worse and worse. How about this? He knew the Old Testament really well. So wouldn't he have known the Psalms and say, why is this happening to me, God? I'm looking at my life. I can't fix my daughter. Why? As the chief religious leader, he's using the capital he has. What is it? It's spiritual capital. That he knows what this God's like, and he's going to him, this God, in his desperation and saying, hey, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to have faith and believe. I'm doing all these things, God. What are you doing? He's using his spiritual capital of the knowledge of the Old Testament and practices of the Old Testament all before he comes to Jesus. But also understand this, he is the archisunnagos. He is the chief leader. As in, he knows everyone in the community. He knows everyone in his particular area. Which means this, he is full of a Rolodex. He knows people, right? He can say to people, hey, I have this problem. Can you help us? Like, you know someone probably. You know me, and I know you. Can you then get us in with this particular doctor or help us? Right? He both has the relational capital. He has a social capital. So his spiritual capital and his social capital are tapped into as the spiritual capital leader. And his daughter is still sick. And he is at the end of himself. This man, chief leader, is at the end of himself. And he's gone to places before he's come to Jesus, hoping that those places will fix his daughter, fix his needs, fix his desperation. Now, what about this woman? What about this woman? She's been bleeding. Now, in our day, if we hear that someone's bleeding internally, sympathy flows from us. Right? We can think to ourselves, that is so hard, that is horrific, that's tough. We really do feel for them. Well, in that day, this is a problem. That this woman's bleeding inside. And in the Old Testament, what blood signifies was something of uncleanliness. Something that you don't want to touch, you don't want to get near. Or else then that uncleanliness would then transfer upon you. And so what we see here is this woman's bleeding, and she has an issue. But guess what? She is the issue. That actually she is so marked with such desperation because actually it's not just a problem she has, she is the problem, that she is unclean, that no one gets near her. That she is someone who's marked with such a liability to society that people don't want to deal with her. Now, what is the resistance she has to desperation? How does she find herself in different places before she finds herself with Jesus? For her, we see explicitly in the text that she has these business cards, that she has these doctors she has gone to, that she has gone the rational, reasonable, physiological route and paid the price to do it, of going to them and saying, hey, I am being referred and having consults. I'm going to the right people to fix me. I'm going to those particular places that make sense. It's logical. It's reasonable. All the while, those people aren't making her better. There's the logic and reason capital she has. She's without excuse there. She's going to the people that can fix her. But also, explicitly in the text also, she's got no money. That she's gone through all of her financial capital. She has spent every dime she has on those doctors, and guess what? Actually, it's pretty amazing that it's in a kindness that we hear like she's gotten worse. She hasn't gotten any better. Actually, she gets worse and worse and worse, even after going to the people that should fix her. She's done the rational, reasonable thing, and she's had the financial capital spent, and she's still sick, and she's still at the end of herself. We see two people who are still having their problems, and all those things that they've gone to before they've gone to Jesus have led them to come to the end of themselves. They're desperate, and they've gotten to that point of desperation in a very, very honest way. They've gone to the places that should fix them, and those things and those places have fallen short. They've come to their desperation in an honest way, all because they've tried to resist their desperation. They've tried to resist being desperate, right? They've tried to make sure that they don't know need. And here they are having need. And we also try our darndest to make sure we don't know need, to make sure we have these resistances. We have these things that we kind of grab onto when something kind of begins to come near us that could threaten us or cause desperation or need in us. We have the ability in our world, no matter what socioeconomic bracket you may be in, or ties you may have, or capital you have, we have ways in which we can, in a very reasonable way, be adaptable to the things that hit us in life. This week, on Thursday, our daughter was playing in the creek at my mother-in-law's, her grandmother's house. And she's playing in the creek, cute and all, this is great. Well, she fell in the creek, that happens. Well, she stepped up on a rock that was just covered in green, which means her feet just went out from her, and she nailed her face. Her face just met the rock, and that rock is undefeated. Because her face, she got up, she was crying, and I went and hugged her and then looked down, and there's just blood covering her face. And so immediately I knew what to do. Immediately I knew, because this is the fourth time she's gotten stitches on her head in her 4 years of living, but I just knew what to do. You go to the doctor, you go to the ER, and they fix you. And you know what, immediately in my mind I thought, okay, we have insurance, we'll figure out how to pay for this, all these different kind of things. But what happened? I saw a need and I knew how to approach it. Things make sense. I could navigate that. I could adapt to what was happening. When things happen in our life that cause some kind of need or ask us to move into something unknown or have us maybe be out of control, there's a way we can resist desperation because of these capital that we can grab on, no matter what it may be. That's what we see in these two people in the story. It's what we see in our lives too. We love to fix problems. We also love to make sure we don't have problems in the first place. We kind of both reactive and proactively address resistance to desperation. Because we ask particular things to fix our desperation, but also we ask things to keep us from desperation. Because you can think to yourself, even now, sitting where you are, if blank happens, at least I have fill in the blank, or at least I would do fill in the blank. Right? If I got sick, I've got insurance. I have PTO, fill in the blank. If I lost my job, I always had this fallback plan in the back of my head. And I've got all this nest egg stored away, right? If this one particular relationship does not work out and is fried, at least I have these people to go to, these people to hold my hat on and be connected with. Am I saying it's bad to plan ahead? No, not at all. Am I maybe pointing out that we have maybe a resistance as we go to different things to keep us from being desperate? I'll let you answer that question. Now, like Jairus, like this woman, it makes sense that we have these things that we grab onto to ask us to fix us or fix our situation so we don't have to feel desperate. And the beautiful thing is, Jairus and this woman got the real Jesus. Though they went to these places of resistance to desperation, these places to fix their desperation, they went to all these different things like spiritual capital, like social capital, like rational, reasonable logic of going to doctors, financial capital. They went to all these different things, and once those things didn't work out for them, then they got to Jesus. But when they did get to Jesus, what did they say? They said the exact same thing to him. And that's the dots connecting with these two different people. Because they said the same thing to him. They said, only if you come will you make us well. If you want to put that slide up. We see Jairus says to Jesus, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. Woman, for she said, just thought to herself, if even I touch his garment, I will be made well. The point of desperation is the point in which all the resistance to desperation doesn't work out, and they get to the point in which they say, only if Jesus gets involved here will I be made well. Will I be made well? And we don't like having to be so lacking in control, to have to ask that question of, can you just please make this well, Jesus? I've asked other things to make this well, all the things and the assets in my toolbox. But now those haven't worked out, so make them well. In order for us to meet the real Jesus, get the real Jesus, we have to ask him in an earnest way, Jesus, only if you come, like they did, will this situation, will I be made well? Will desperation be fixed? And that's going to be a really hard thing to do, to ask Jesus, make this well, unless we begin to name the places of resistance to feeling desperate. Unless we begin to name the places and the things where we go to before we get to Jesus. Not naming them as bad, but also all the while naming what we're asking of those things. So what are those things of resistance to desperation, those things you go to of, this is the fix-it. Right, this is going to be the thing that curbs me from feeling so desperate. Social or spiritual, professional, financial, all in this text, and also all in our world too, all our lives too. And as we answer that question of what are the resistances to desperation like they did and like I do, when we begin to answer that question and we come to this Jesus, he will then respond to us. And that's this next idea. There's a resistance that we have to Jesus, to desperation, but he has a response to our desperation. He responds to us. Again, this is conversations with Jesus. He's talking to the desperate. What does he say? Now, Jesus' words in this story are pretty sparse. Even this Monday, we were talking about it, and we all were kind of scratching our head of, like, I think this is a conversation. Because there's not many words. It's not super dense. And yet, what we need to see is there's power in, even as he speaks, and he does, there's plenty of things we don't understand. And that's the point, maybe. That when we come to Jesus with our desperation, we say, hey, I've gone to all these different things, and now I'm finally coming to you. Would you fix it? We kind of think to ourselves, he's saying there, glad you're here. Look, okay, so here's the plan. Boom, bop, beep. Right? Here's the approach I'm going to have, and fix it like that, so in ways that we can fully grasp and understand. And Jesus doesn't have that. We don't see that in here. How does he communicate? How does he respond to the desperate? Well, the first thing that we see is there's a commencement. There's a commencement as he responds to the desperate. Meaning this, that what really gets Jesus moving toward these people who are desperate? He moves toward them when they say to him, if you come, everything will be okay. When they're finally at the point of saying, I need you to make this well, that's when he says, I can do a lot with that. I can do a great deal with that. It's game time. It's on when we let him in. And we let him in when we say to him, Jesus, only this can be made well if you come, if you enter the picture, if your power is at hand. There's a commencement that Jesus has when we begin to open ourselves up to saying, you are the only one that I can go to right now. You're the one I'm running to. You are the fixer of this. I can't go to anywhere else but you. He can do a lot with that. He commences with that in his response to our desperation. There's a commencement, but also there's confusion. There's confusion. This woman is in this crowd as he's going from the place that the synagogue leader finds him to the synagogue leader's house. And he's going there, and he's going in this big crowd. I mean, it really is depicted like this kind of cult following of this kind of big mass of people going. And this woman touches him, doesn't ask him to touch him, just creepily says, I just want to touch him. You get arrested for that these days. But if you touch Taylor Swift and don't ask. So, but what we see here is, what does Jesus say? He says, who touched me? It says, perceiving that power had left him, he says, who touched me? And there's confusion on the part of the disciples. Hey, Jesus, so we know that you may not be like the most socially aware person, but you are in a mass of people right now. So you just said, who touched you? I think you might have just, are you joking? Who touched you? There's people following you everywhere. Who touched you? And then later on, we see he finally gets to Jairus' house, and the woman, his little daughter's died, and they're weeping. It says they're all crying. And Jesus comes in and says, "Why are you crying? She's asleep." Again, very socially aware Jesus. This is literally the fresh moment that death has come and met this girl, and you come up and not even just unaware, but it's also just, it's wildly insensitive. She just died, and you said, she's sleeping? And actually what they do is not question him like the disciples do. What they do is they're crying, they stop their crying for a moment to laugh at him. They literally are laughing and so they don't have to cry. What we see here is confusion. Desperation has us looks at Jesus' words, Jesus' approach, Jesus' plan, and it says to him, hey, that doesn't fly here. Who touched you? She's sleeping? Like, that doesn't work in our paradigm. There's confusion in Jesus' response because guess what? He's the man of sorrows, but also understand he's the man of being misunderstood. As his kingdom comes and it meets our reality, it makes sense those things don't line up and we can't understand it all. And desperation has us presume that we know really what's happening. We really know what should happen. We know it makes sense because what desperation would have us say is we presume hope is not a possibility because hope has sailed with the things that we have gone to and haven't fixed and worked for us. Jesus, there's no way there could be a reality outside of what we see. Therefore, we say things like, who touched you? What do you mean? That doesn't make sense in our minds. She's sleeping? That's crazy talk. I mean, think of the Old Testament book of Job. You don't have to know the Old Testament all that well, but it's this man who is upright. He's known for being a heart for God. And in this kind of first chapters and verses, we see this dialogue between the good guy and the bad guy, God and Satan. And Satan says, hey, I bet Job serves you for nothing. I bet he is just in it because everything's easy and fine and palatable. It's a good life to follow you, God. Let me test him. Let me test him to see if Job's allegiance and love of you is really actually authentic and earnest. And God says, okay, I'll let you do it. And then what happens? All this suffering begins to happen to Job. And there's a point in which there's a presumption in Job's friends and his kind of community that says, okay, we see something's happening in your life that are really, really hard. What have you done? Like, what sins are you keeping underneath the floorboards of your heart? Because there's no way, in our presumption, there's no way that what we're seeing makes sense other than you're the problem. Right? There's confusion that can happen when all of a sudden we actually let desperation shape the story instead of letting Jesus and his work shape our desperation. There's commencement, there's confusion in Jesus' response to desperation. Also, there's coordination. There's coordination. And this one's a harder one to pill to swallow. Because the reality is that Jesus knew every single place he would go. Jesus knew every single conversation he'd have, every person he would interact with. Jesus knew everyone, and also everyone inside of themselves. He had everything, and he had perfect timing for each of those particular people. That's a theological kind of foundational bedrock. Let's test that out. When did this woman have healing power? After she spent all of her money and went to all the doctors. So once she did all of that, then she experiences Jesus' healing. I mean, come on. Don't you think she would have thought, man, this would have been a whole lot less expensive if you'd have just kind of healed me first. Like, my HSA would be a whole lot bigger, Jesus, if we had done this healing thing sooner. Even this man, right? Jairus says, hey, Jesus, come and fix my daughter, heal her. If you come, it'll happen. They're going. He says, I'm in. They're walking. What happens as they're going? There's this divine detour. There's this interruption that Jesus gets tied up with this woman in this conversation with this gal who's sick. And you got to imagine, picture the scene. What is Jairus doing as Jesus is talking to the woman? Like, hey, can we go now? Like, we're heading somewhere and this woman interrupted us. Can we get to the thing that I need to be fixed? And guess what, even worse? The girl dies as Jesus and this woman are talking. Would you not be livid? Jesus, we were going somewhere and all of a sudden you decided to stop and do your pretty little conversation thing while my girl is dying and now she's dead. Wouldn't it make sense in you that you would be hot, to say the least? Certainly sad. We got to understand, all of those places are marked with deep coordination, that Jesus has them exactly where they need to be to experience his healing power. Jesus could have gone straight to Jairus' house and knocked on the door and him say, hey, I know everything that is of this world, therefore I figured I might do a little house call and heal this girl before she dies. He could have done that, and he didn't do it. There's something about the mind of God and the plan of God that he puts us exactly in the places we need to be to experience his power, and often those places that we have to be in to experience his power are marked with desperation. Only then, only the places that he coordinates and he puts us in, could we experience his healing power, his grace. And they're all in the perfect coordinated time. Commencement, confusion, coordination. Lastly, it's snuck in here, but there's this, in this conversation, as he responds to the desperate, he calls the desperate something. He calls them something. Now, it's really just seasoned in there. Almost like a magnifying glass, you got to find it. What does he say to this girl who has been bleeding for years? Who touched me, he said. And it says she realizes kind of, the jig is up. Like, I went and touched him. He knows I did it. And so she runs to him, falls at his feet, and says, hey, and it says, she began to tell him her story, essentially. Kind of what it says. Hey, I've been bleeding for years, and I can't get it to stop. I've gone to all these people to fix me. They haven't fixed me yet. And I just thought if I just touched you, I'd be better, and I'm better now. I'm sorry I did it. I didn't ask you, but what does he say to that? As this woman is at his feet, almost kind of groveling, like saying sorry for having faith. What does he say to her? He says, woman. Woman. Now, when we hear that, in our age and time, in our modern world, we hear woman, and actually what that signals is kind of a derogatory term. A man calling a woman, kind of putting her in her place almost. And that couldn't be farther than what's happening here. Because what's happening here is, when Jesus says woman, what it actually is this deep, intimate, connecting word and phrase that Jesus takes in a way that says, I'm looking right at you, and I'm seeing you, and I'm so warm toward you. He says, woman, it's almost like he's looking straight into her eyes and her soul and saying, this God, this Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, is saying, I see you, woman. You're mine. I mean, think in John 2, at the wedding of Cana, the wine runs out. Jesus' mom sees, we got a party problem here, and so goes to the party planning committee and says, Jesus, hey, there's no more wine. Fix it. But make this go away. Make this problem go away. What does he say? He says, woman, my time hasn't come yet. He's not saying, hey, listen, mom, listen, lady, this isn't my problem quite yet. He says, woman, my time hasn't come yet, because when I see wine, I see my blood. But I will provide for the party now. When he says woman, it's deeply dignifying. It's deeply intimate. What does he say to the little girl? Little girl. Helpless and tender. You got to understand, this little girl just died. I don't know what she saw when she died. What was the first thing that she saw? She saw the eyes of Jesus. What is the first thing that she heard? Little girl. Doesn't that maybe give you hope for when your story ends? What's the first thing you're going to see? What's the first thing you're going to hear? what we see in the response that Jesus has to desperation is he's calling these people these deeply intimate, deeply warm, deeply safe names. It's saying, you are mine. Like, we are so good. You are so good, and I'm here to help you. I see you in your desperation. I see you in your need, and I am moving toward you and calling you something. In his response, we see a commencement, a confusion, coordination, calling. And as he does all those things, what do we see? Desperation. Desperation just dissipates. It just evaporates. It goes away. And Jesus' response. And so we got to apply all these questions to us now. Because the question is, where does commencement need to happen? Commencement happened in these people when they said, I've gone everywhere else, and I'm coming to you to make me well. That's when Jesus can do a lot. He can commence and start doing a whole lot of things when we begin to say that to him. Where do you need to say that to him in your life now? Jesus, I'm coming to you because of this particular thing. He can do a lot with that. He can start and commence with a lot. Confusion. Or is there confusion in your life? Because you're seeing all of a sudden, Jesus is not just maybe saying things like he is in this story, but he's doing things, and they don't match up with the paradigm. And actually, you've gotten so desperate in your world, if even marked with despair, that you begin to see what Jesus is doing, and you presume there's no way that good can come of this. This is too confusing, Jesus. Your kingdom isn't matching up with my reality. Where's there confusion? How could hope come from this thing? Where's their coordination? There's a deep reality that makes sense that Jesus has you exactly where he has you in this particular moment, all to show you something about himself, just like he did with those people. And often, what we see of those people, it's marked with these divine detours. This woman's been bleeding for years. Jairus is trying to get from A to B to get his daughter who's at B healed. There's different roads and paths, but all what we see is Jesus has them in the perfect coordinated spot to experience his healing. Is that true of you? If he is in control, are you not in the perfect coordinated spot right now to encounter the Jesus who wants to meet you in your desperation? And lastly, calling. What is Jesus calling you right now? Because the beautiful thing is when you kind of begin to actually invert this story, and when you begin to say, actually, Jesus, you're meeting me in my desperation so much that when you begin to call me something so intimate, so safe, so secure, when you're calling me woman, little daughter, when you call me son, when you call me beloved, when you call me those things, everything else like the coordination, like the confusion, like the commencement begin to fall into place because I'm so safe here that I can trust you as you're working in my life. What do we see as Jesus responds to the desperate? He's ready to move toward the things that are the issues in your life, but he's ready to move toward you. And he will use those things to get to you. That's how committed he is to you. That's his response. But lastly, what's the right of desperation? R-I-T-E, meaning as we live lives that are marked with desperation and things that we don't have any control over and we have no access to fix or remedy, what's the right? Like what's the deep act of desperation all of a sudden teach us? How are we different as we go through desperation? Now, when I was in college, I had cancer, and I had a particular cancer, and I had heard that one professor on campus had the very same cancer at the very same time. And so I went and met up with him in his office, and we began to talk and talked about all the medical things and stuff. And one thing that he began to say that I'll never forget is he said, when I was your age, almost exactly, and I had the exact same cancer, I remember leaning back in the chair, in that recliner, during chemo and thinking to myself, I've never been more dependent upon God than I am right now. And it was this peace that rolled over him. It's amazing. And then he said something I didn't expect, because I knew that. He said, and all of a sudden, as I had the peace roll over me, I had also this grief roll over me too, because all of a sudden I realized, once I get better, I'm going to go right back to the self-sufficiency I knew even before I got sick. Even as he's in the moment of desperation, he knows, I'm just going to run right back to what I really did and how I lived beforehand once I get through it. Once we get through it, we'll be okay. Once the reality that we get through it and desperation is gone, it's business as usual. And C.S. Lewis marks and notes this. He says this. This is a very hearty quote, but it's very heartening. I'll explain it as we go along. C.S. Lewis says, "My own experience is something like this. I'm progressing along the path of life in my ordinary, contentably fallen and godless condition, absorbed in a merry meeting with my friends for the morrow, or a bit of work that tickles my vanity today, a holiday or a new book, when suddenly a stab of abdominal pain that threatens serious disease, or a headline in the news that threatens us all with destruction, sends this whole pack of cards tumbling down." Meaning, everything is good in the hood, everything's fine, until some kind of disturbance of the peace occurs. That's what he's saying. He goes on. "At first, I'm overwhelmed, and all my little happinesses look like broken toys. Then, slowly and reluctantly, bit by bit, I try to bring myself into the frame of mind that I should be in at all times. I remind myself that all these toys were never intended to possess my heart, and that my true good is in another world, and my only treasure is Christ. And perhaps by God's grace I succeed, and for a day or two become a creature consciously dependent on God and drawing its strength from the right sources." Meaning, when he all of a sudden he's being desperate, is when he really realizes, I'm made for this. I'm made to be dependent upon God. In my desperation, I see clearly and coherently. He goes on. "But the moment the threat is withdrawn, my whole nature leaps back to the toys. I'm even anxious, God forgive me, to banish from my mind the only thing that supported me under the threat, because it is now associated with the misery of those few days." He's saying, once I'm okay, I'm just going to go back to the toys. I'm going to go back to the self-sufficiency like that professor said. Thus, the terrible necessity of tribulation is only too clear. God has had, for me, but 48 hours, and then, only by dint of taking everything else away from me, let him but seize the sword for a moment, and I behave like a puppy when the hated bath is over. Once the threat is gone, I'm okay. I shake myself dry as I can and race off to reacquire my comfortable dirtiness, if not in the nearest manure heap, at least in the nearest flower bed. And that is why tribulations cannot cease until God either sees us remade or sees that our remaking is now hopeless. He's saying that we're made for the moments of desperation. We're made for the moments of need. We're made for the moments of tribulation, not because God is trying to torture us, but it's in those moments that God actually begins to meet us and we begin to see ourselves all the more clearly. We begin to see ourselves actually we're built for dependence, not desperation. How does desperation change us? What is a mark of the right of desperation? It's when all of a sudden we're dependent upon God like we should be all the time. When desperation runs its course in the fullest, bestest way, best is not a word, it produces dependence in us. Dependence in us. Because a desperate heart would say this, when it begins to have a threat, it says, how am I going to get through this? What am I going to use to fix this and remedy this? That's what a heart of desperation says. A heart of dependence says something totally different. It says, what are you going to show me, Jesus? What are you going to show me, Jesus? The first response, how am I going to get through this, looks at my approach, my assets, the way I'm going to remedy this. And the second says, I totally believe, or at least I'm trying to believe, I am so yours that actually you will use the things in my life to show me yourself, especially the places of desperation. Therefore, Jesus, what are you trying to show me? As we begin to do that, we begin to look to this Jesus that actually modeled dependence for us. All throughout the gospel, we see in there Jesus is dependent upon his Father, even while he's marked with desperation and hard times. He's dependent upon his Father. And as we look upon dependence to Jesus, we can know we're safe with him, because even as he was dependent upon his Father, we're safe because he was unsafe. He went to the cross. He was not marked with a safety. That we're secure because he walked into insecurity for us. That actually we are so held all the while he was abandoned. He was forsaken. The Jesus we go to is one that deals with us and to us. He's actually more committed to seeing us than just fixing our problems. And therefore, spiritual maturity is not just us trying to get better at fixing our life, kind of with this spiritual veneer. Spiritual maturity is actually realizing I'm actually going to bypass the things of asking all of these particular capitals and resistances to desperation. I'm going to bypass all of them to get to Jesus quicker. That's what spiritual maturity looks like as we move from desperation to dependence. Let me pray. Jesus, we pray now that you would help us come to you and fall at your feet. That's what the actions of Jairus and the woman did. They came to you and they fell at your feet. So may we do that. And the words that they had were, make me well, make my desperation well. If only if you come will this be. Jesus, give us this posture of falling at your feet and give us the words of desperation. And all in that, make us a people dependent upon you, because you are a God that is moving toward us to change us. We pray this, Christ, in your name. Amen.